You are standing in the temple courtyard in Jerusalem, and the men around you are reaching for stones. In a moment, you'll understand why. It comes down to 7 statements Jesus made, and one that finally went too far. To understand what got him there, you have to start 3 years earlier. On a grass hillside in Galilee, 5,000 people are still chewing. The man who just made the bread looks out at them and says 5 words nobody in the crowd yet fully understands. If you grew up in church, you've probably heard the sentence he says next, quoted as a warm devotional line. I am the bread of life. Most people read those words as a gentle metaphor about spiritual nourishment. They aren't. They're a legal claim to be the God of the Old Testament. Specifically, the God who sent manna down from heaven in Exodus chapter 16, verse 4, to feed Israel in the wilderness. The people holding bread in their hands that afternoon were being told their bread had a maker, and he was standing in front of them. Picture yourself in that crowd for a second. You are still chewing. The barley is still on your fingers. And the man in front of you has just told you where the bread actually came from. And it's only the first of 7. By the end of this video, you'll know all 7 I am statements of Jesus in the Gospel of John. You'll know the specific Old Testament title of God each one echoes. And you'll see why every single one was a divinity claim most modern readers miss entirely. Miss this pattern and you miss the central argument of the 4th Gospel. And you miss why the religious leaders eventually picked up stones to kill him in the middle of the temple. Why did Jesus choose the word door when he wasn't standing near a door? Which statement did he make during the biggest light festival of the Jewish year? And why did the timing turn the claim into something even bigger? And which of the 8, yes, there are actually 8, finally made the crowd reach for rocks? Let's start where the crowd was still chewing. The morning after the feeding of the 5,000, the crowd came back. They asked Jesus for a sign. They said their ancestors ate manna in the desert, and Moses gave them bread from heaven. Jesus answered that Moses didn't give them the bread. God gave them the bread. And the real bread, the one that came down from heaven, was standing in front of them. Think about that for a second. The crowd is holding bread, asking about manna, and being told who actually sent it. Most of us have heard I am the bread of life at a communion table or on a greeting card. If you've ever felt something quiet land when those words were read, that feeling isn't wrong. It's just smaller than what the first crowd on the hillside actually heard, which was a man standing in front of them, claiming to be the God of the wilderness. If the first statement was said on a hillside surrounded by bread, what festival was Jesus standing in the middle of when he called himself the light of the world? And why did the timing turn the claim into something even bigger? There is a specific kind of dark you only know if you've never lived with electricity. Not the dark of your bedroom at night. The dark outside a city on a starless evening, when you can't see your own hand in front of your face. That dark is what the Feast of Tabernacles was built to end, once a year, for 8 days, with a bonfire of lamps bright enough to light up the whole city. The second I am statement isn't said in a quiet room. It's said in the middle of that festival. 4 enormous menorahs stood in the court of women, each one several stories tall. The oil lamps at the top were lit every night of tabernacles. The Mishnah, in Tractate Sukkah, says there was not a courtyard in Jerusalem that did not shine with the light of those 4 lamps. The entire city glowed from that single spot in the temple. Jesus is standing in that courtyard, surrounded by that light, when he says, I am the light of the world. Psalm 27 verse 1 calls the Lord my light and my salvation. Isaiah chapter 60 verse 19 promises that the Lord himself will be the everlasting light of his people. Both passages assign the title to God. On the brightest night of the Jewish calendar, in the courtyard built specifically to display that light, a man points at the menorahs and says he is the thing they were built to represent. Stop and picture that. The lamps above you are the biggest spectacle in the Jewish year. Every face in the court is lit from above. And someone standing in that light says quietly, those were always mine. If you've ever stood in a dark place and watched someone light a single lamp, you know the way a flame rearranges the room. The people standing in that courtyard had been singing psalms about God as their light their entire lives. Then this, 2 chapters later, Jesus moves the metaphor. He says, I am the door of the sheep, in John chapter 10 verse 9. Which sounds like a strange sentence until you know what a first-century sheepfold actually looked like. Sheepfolds in that region were low stone walls in a rough circle with a single opening. They had no wooden gate. At night, the shepherd laid his own body across the opening and slept there. If a wolf or a thief wanted to get in, they had to step over him. The shepherd's body was the gate. Psalm 118 verse 20 calls the gate of the Lord the entrance the righteous walk through. When Jesus says he's the door of the sheep, he isn't describing a piece of wood, he's describing himself. And he's claiming the entrance the psalm reserves for God. Two statements, both in charge locations, both claiming titles the Old Testament had already assigned to someone else. Notice what just happened in two short paragraphs. A sentence about bread, a sentence about light, a sentence about a door. Three ordinary images, all belonging to God in the Old Testament, all now quietly on one man's lips. If the door was the shepherd's own body, what was the shepherd himself? And why did Jesus answer that question with an entire chapter of Ezekiel? Imagine walking into a funeral and hearing someone at the door say, quietly, "I am the reason your brother is not staying dead." You would not file that away as a metaphor. You would turn and look. The fourth I am statement isn't soft pastoral imagery. It's a full chapter of Ezekiel claimed out loud. The fifth is set at a tomb, and it claims a power the law reserved for God alone. Ezekiel chapter 34 verse 11 sits inside an entire chapter where God goes after Israel's corrupt shepherds. The kings and priests who were supposed to care for the people have been eating the sheep instead of feeding them. And God speaks in the first person in verses 11 and 15 and says, "I myself will be the shepherd of my sheep. I will search for them. I will tend them in good pasture." When Jesus says, "I am the good shepherd," in John chapter 10 verse 11, he isn't being gentle. He's stepping into Ezekiel 34. The people listening had heard that chapter read in synagogue. They knew who the shepherd was supposed to be. And this man in front of them just said it was him. Then the fifth statement. It's set at a tomb. Lazarus has been dead 4 days. His sister Martha meets Jesus on the road and says, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." If you've ever watched someone you love get lowered into a grave, her next line will hit you differently. She says, "But even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you." And Jesus answers her in John chapter 11 verse 25, "I am the resurrection and the life." Here's the line most modern readers skip over. Deuteronomy chapter 32 verse 39 is one of the oldest poems in the Bible, and in that poem, God speaks for himself. "See now that I, even I, am he. I kill and I make alive." The authority to decide whether someone stays dead belonged to God alone. Jesus doesn't say he has access to resurrection, he says he is resurrection. Anyone who has ever lost someone knows what a tomb feels like. The claim Jesus makes at Lazarus' grave isn't decorative. It says the authority that decides whether your brother stays in the ground is standing at the door. If Jesus has already claimed to be the shepherd of Ezekiel and the resurrection authority of Deuteronomy, what's left for him to claim? And when does the metaphor finally drop? There is a difference between knowing the way to a place and being the way to a place. A map knows the way, a road is the way. The map can burn, the road still gets you there. Two statements are still left, and Jesus saves them for the last week of his life. At the Last Supper, Thomas asks a real question. "Lord, we don't know where you're going. How can we know the way?" The question is about directions. Jesus doesn't give him any. He says in John chapter 14 verse 6, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." Isaiah chapter 35 verse 8 speaks of something called the Way of Holiness. It's a highway God himself builds for his redeemed people to walk home on. The road only God can make. When Jesus says he is the way, he's claiming to be that road. Then the vine. Minutes later, walking out of the supper toward the garden where he'll be arrested, Jesus says, "I am the true vine," in John chapter 15 verse 1. Here's the thing about that image. In Isaiah chapter 5 verse 7, God plants Israel as his vineyard, and it produces sour grapes. In Psalm 80 verse 8, Israel is a vine brought out of Egypt that gets burned and trampled. In Jeremiah chapter 2 verse 21, God says, "I planted you a choice vine, wholly of pure seed. How then have you turned degenerate?" In Hosea chapter 10 verse 1, Israel is an empty vine. The metaphor never flatters anyone. Israel is the vine that failed. When Jesus says he is the true vine, he isn't grabbing a pretty image off a shelf. He is taking Israel's failed role and saying he will be what the nation was called to be. Quietly, without announcement. just a sentence between supper and the garden. This is the quietest of the seven, and in its quietness, one of the most audacious. Think of a keyring you've never seen before. 7 keys hanging on it. And somewhere in another room, there's a door you cannot see yet. A door from the Old Testament. A specific door God has been keeping for himself since Exodus. You try the first key, it fits. You try the second, it fits. You try all 7. Every single one of them opens the same door. The keys aren't the point. The door is, and the man holding the keyring is quietly telling you he owns the door. If you're finding connections in this that you've never seen before, share this video with someone who loves digging into the Bible. And subscribe if you want more of these. So let's take a breath and look at where we've been. 7 statements, all 7 now on the table. Bread, light, and door, the things God promised to provide in the wilderness. Shepherd and resurrection. The authority God kept for himself in the law and the prophets. Way and vine. The access and the identity Israel was supposed to hold and that Jesus has quietly taken back. Every single one of these is an Old Testament title of God, placed deliberately on Jesus' own lips in John's Gospel. But that's only 7. There's an 8th one coming, and it's the one that finally made the crowd reach for rocks. So what does Jesus say, finally, that the crowd cannot tolerate? Which statement drops every metaphor and makes the religious leaders reach for stones in the middle of the temple? There is a moment in every argument when someone says the one thing that can't be taken back. Everyone in the room goes still. The air itself feels different. You know, without being told, that something has just changed that cannot be undone. The 8th statement isn't on the list of 7. It doesn't have a metaphor. It's said during Tabernacles, the same festival as the light of the world moment, in the middle of a running argument with the religious leaders. And when it lands, the crowd reaches for stones before Jesus has finished the sentence. The argument in John chapter 8 has been escalating for the entire chapter. Who is your father? Who are you? Are you greater than Abraham? The leaders press him. You are not yet 50 years old. Have you seen Abraham? Jesus does not say, I knew Abraham. He does not say, I was there before Abraham was born. He uses 2 Greek words, ego eimi, I am, not I was, I am, now in the present tense, the tense God used of himself at the burning bush. Here's why those 2 words matter. In the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament every Greek-speaking Jew in the 1st century read in synagogue, ego eimi is the phrase God uses when he speaks his own identity. At the burning bush in Exodus chapter 3, verse 14, God's self-revelation in Greek begins with those 2 words. And throughout Isaiah 40 through 55, God repeatedly uses ego eimi to declare who he is. The phrase carried the weight of divine self-disclosure in the scriptures. Jesus' audience had been hearing read in synagogue their whole lives. The phrase is the divine name. And Jesus says in John chapter 8 verse 58, before Abraham was, I am. Think about the last time someone told you they loved you. The words themselves are small, 8 letters in English. But if the right person says them to you at the right moment, those small words can reorganize your whole life. 2 words in Greek, ego eimi, did the same thing at the temple that afternoon. 2 words, and the people standing closest to him heard what the words actually meant and reached for stones. The text in John is explicit. They took up stones to throw at him. Not because claiming seniority over Abraham was a capital offense, because using the divine name was. Under Jewish law, in Leviticus 24 verse 16, using God's own name was blasphemy, and the prescribed penalty was stoning. Most of us have been in an argument that pivoted on a single sentence. Something was said, and the room couldn't go back. That's what happens in John 8. The metaphors drop, 2 Greek words land, and the crowd understands. So if every I am was a divinity claim wrapped in a metaphor, and the 8 stripped the metaphor and used the divine name outright, why did John, writing decades later, arrange his gospel this way? There is a reason architects use 7 columns. There is a reason composers use 8 notes in a scale. Patterns aren't decoration. They tell you what the builder was thinking when the building was built. John's gospel is the only one of the 4 structured around repeating 7s. 7 signs, which are miracles, and 7 I am statements, plus an 8th that breaks both patterns. That isn't accidental. John himself tells us why he wrote the way he did. Near the end of his gospel, in chapter 20, verse 31, he says, "These are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." The I am structure is his argument. 7 statements build the case through metaphor. The 8th delivers the verdict without one. Most Bible scholars read the arrangement as John's deliberate case for who Jesus is. Richard Bauckham has argued that John's Gospel carries authentic eyewitness tradition behind the theological shape. A different tradition in critical scholarship, going back to Rudolf Bultmann, has read the predicate statements as later construction by John's community rather than Jesus' own words. Even in that reading, the absolute I am at chapter 8, verse 58 is in the earliest manuscripts. The stoning response is right there in the text. The debate about the other 7 doesn't touch the 8th. The arrangement is a legal brief. 7 statements of precedent. 1 closing argument that drops every metaphor. And a jury that reached for stones. If you've ever read John and felt like it was organized differently from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you were right. It's a structured case for who Jesus is. And the I am statements are the spine of it. So if the first 7 statements set up the 8th, what did the people who heard them that afternoon walk away understanding? And what did John want us, 2,000 years later, to walk away understanding? There is a way of looking at old photographs that only works once you know how the story ends. The people in the photograph didn't know. You do. And the photograph looks different because of it. 3 things carry across all of this. First, the I am statements were never poetry. They were legal claims in a courtroom only some of the audience could see. Every time Jesus said I am, a specific Old Testament door opened behind him, and he was standing in the doorway. The metaphors were not soft, they were precise. Second, the stoning response at John chapter 8 verse 58 is what tells you how the first century audience actually heard Jesus. They didn't hear a prophet. They didn't hear a teacher with a high opinion of himself. They heard someone using God's own name, and the law told them what to do with that. The stones aren't a random reaction. They're a legal verdict. And the third thing, the one that stays with me the most, is this. The 7 predicate statements are all offers. Bread when you are hungry. Light when you can't see. A door when you need shelter. A shepherd when you are lost. Resurrection when the tomb is sealed. A way home when you don't know the road. A vine when you can't bear fruit on your own. Every claim to divinity is also an invitation. The stones on the floor were one response. The offers are still on the table. That afternoon on the hillside, the crowd held bread in their hands and didn't yet know what they were being offered. Weeks later, in a temple court, the stones dropped from the hands of a different crowd who had figured it out. Both crowds heard the same 2 words. Only one of them stopped to pick up what he was actually handing them. If this gave you a new way to read John,